The bespoke, handcrafted Italian leather of a $5,000 boot connected with Soraya's shoulder before the mall's festive music could even register a change in tempo. She was sent spiraling into a towering, gold-leaf display, crystalline Christmas ornaments exploding like shrapnel as she hit the marble. Her simple, dark maid's uniform, the one she wore with quiet pride while serving the city's most powerful matriarch, snagged on the metal edge of a designer stand, tearing as she crashed to the floor. For a heartbeat, the gilded halls of the latte luxury wing went deathly silent. Soraya looked up from the cold floor, her vision swimming, to see Julian standing over her, his eyes filled with a terrifying, familiar contempt. "Still a servant, Soraya? I see you finally found a uniform that matches your worth. Stay in the dirt where you belong," Julian sneered, his voice dripping with the same poison he used when he discarded her years ago. He had no idea who she was anymore. No idea that the disposable woman he remembered, the one he'd left in the rain with nothing but a torn suitcase and a broken heart, was gone. He had no idea that she had become the only person in Seoul trusted to care for the mother of the Han syndicate. He had no idea about the encrypted satellite phone tucked into her apron, or that the mall's high-definition security cameras were currently streaming this exact moment to a blacked-out Bentley speeding toward the entrance. And Julian definitely had no idea about the man whose shadow now loomed over the entire city, a man who famously hated women but had spent every night for the last month watching Soraya's silhouette through the villa's library doors. Han Saiwoo. The Mafia King. The man who had just seen Julian lay a hand on the only piece he had ever known. As Soraya's trembling fingers swiped the screen to answer the incoming call, Han Saiwoo's voice, heavy with a lethal, vibrating calm, echoed through her earpiece, "Don't move, Soraya. I see him." She watched as a flicker of unease finally touched Julian's face. He thought he was bullying a maid. He didn't realize he had just declared war on a god. And in approximately 6 minutes, when Saiwoo's armored fleet breached the perimeter of this mall, Julian Vane was going to learn a lesson about consequences that would destroy his entire world. He still thought she was nothing. That was about to change. Before we reveal the terrifying moment Han Saiwoo steps out of that lead vehicle to reclaim what's his, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. You don't want to miss a single second of this journey of revenge and redemption. Your support helps us bring more of these intense stories to life. High above the city, in the silent, leather-scented sanctuary of a blacked-out Bentley, Han Saiwoo did not move. His eyes were fixed on the glowing crystal of the dashboard tablet, which displayed a live, multi-angle feed of the latte luxury wing. To the world, Saiwoo was a ghost, the woman-hater whose heart was a fortress of ice. But as he watched Julian's boot make contact with Soraya's shoulder, that ice didn't melt, it sharpened into 1,000 jagged blades. He watched the gold leaf display crumble. He watched the woman who sat by his mother's bed every night, reading poetry in a voice that calmed even his darkest impulses, spill onto the marble floor. His grip tightened on the armrest until the heavy stitching groaned under the pressure. Beside him, his lead enforcer, Kim, held his breath. The air in the car had dropped 20 degrees. Saiwoo's gaze traced the way Soraya tried to pull her torn uniform together, her dignity remaining intact even as Julian loomed over her like a predator. He saw the contempt on Julian's face, a face Saiwoo had already marked for erasure. Every instinct Saiwoo possessed, the ones he usually used to dismantle rival syndicates, was now screaming for a different kind of blood. He had spent years avoiding the liability of women, yet seeing Soraya, his mother's quiet, resilient shadow, treated as a footstool triggered a protective fury that was almost primal. "The mall security," Saiwoo whispered, his voice a low, vibrating hum of impending violence. "Tell them to shut the gates. Now." "Sir," the public outcry for a full lockdown, Kim began, but stopped when Saiwoo finally turned his head. His eyes were void of any mercy. "I don't care about the outcry. I care about the 6 feet of floor space Julian Vane is currently occupying," Saiwoo stated, his tone terrifyingly level. "He thinks he is standing in a shopping mall. Make him realize he is standing in a grave. He tapped the screen, zooming in on Soraya's trembling hand as it reached for her phone. He knew exactly what she was feeling, the terror of a past Julian had trapped her in. Saiwoo's thumb hovered over the call button. He wasn't just a mafia king in this moment, he was the orchestrator of a nightmare Marcus could never have dreamed of. As the Bentley screeched onto the sidewalk, ignoring every traffic law in Seoul, Saiwoo pressed the icon. He watched on the screen as Soraya's phone lit up against the cold marble. When the line opened, he didn't scream. He didn't roar. He simply spoke the words that would end Julian's life as he knew it. "Don't move, Soraya. I see him." Outside the tinted windows, the world began to blur as the motorcade accelerated. The hunt had officially begun. Back at the Han estate, the air in the sun-drenched conservatory shattered with the sound of a porcelain teacup hitting the floor. Madame Han, the matriarch whose very name could freeze the assets of a conglomerate with a single phone call, stared at her tablet with wide, horrified eyes. She had been checking the mall's prestige member alerts, expecting to see Soraya's name associated with a successful errands run. Instead, she was watching a grainy, high-definition nightmare. Madame Han's chest heaved. Soraya wasn't just a maid to her, she was the girl who stayed up until 3 in the morning to change her compresses during her bouts of chronic pain, the girl who remembered exactly how she liked her ginger tea, and the only person who treated her like a human being rather than a throne to be inherited. Seeing Soraya's shoulder buckle under Julian's boot felt like a physical strike to the madame's own body. Her face, usually a mask of regal composure, contorted into a snarl of pure, aristocratic fury. She didn't call the police. She didn't call the mall manager. She dialed the one man she knew was already on his way to turn the city red. "Saiwoo," she hissed the moment her son answered. She didn't wait for him to speak. "I am watching it. I am watching that insect treat our Soraya like a stray dog in public. He didn't just kick a girl, Saiwoo. He kicked the honor of the Han family. He kicked me." On the other end of the line, the silence was more terrifying than any scream. Madame Han clutched the edge of her mahogany desk, her knuckles white. "I want him to understand that he is nothing. I want him to watch everything he loves turn to ash before his eyes, just as he tried to break her spirit today. Do you hear me? If that boy is still standing by the time I arrive, I will consider it a failure of your bloodline." "I'm already at the gate, mother," Saiwoo's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding like grinding stones. "The mall is locked. He isn't going anywhere." "Good," she breathed, her voice dropping to a deadly, maternal whisper. "Because I am coming too. And I want to see the look in his eyes when he realizes that the maid he looked down on is the daughter I chose. Tell our men to keep him alive. Death is too merciful for what he's done to my Soraya." She stood up, ignoring the shattered porcelain at her feet, and signaled for her personal guard. The mother of the underworld was no longer a frail woman in a conservatory, she was a lioness whose cub had been touched. As she swept toward her own motorcade, the atmosphere of the entire estate shifted. The mercy of the Han family had just expired. The perimeter of the circle was as impenetrable as a tomb. 12 men, each standing over 6 feet tall and clad in charcoal gray suits that absorbed the mall's brilliant light, moved with a haunting, synchronized grace. They didn't speak. They didn't shout. They simply occupied the space around Soraya and Julian, creating a human wall that separated the wreckage of the Christmas display from the rest of the world. Julian's breath hitched in his throat. He turned in a full circle, his eyes darting from one stone-faced guard to the next, looking for a crack in the formation, a glimmer of hesitation, or even a hint of a bribe he could offer. He found nothing but the cold, professional indifference of killers. These weren't mall security guards, they were the elite vanguards of the Han Syndicate, men handpicked for their loyalty and their lethality. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Julian's voice cracked, the pitch rising in a desperate attempt to reclaim the authority he had felt just moments ago. He reached into his coat, perhaps for a business card or his wallet, but the movement was too sudden. The guard directly in front of him moved so fast it was a blur. Before Julian could even blink, a heavy, gloved hand was clamped around his wrist, twisting it just enough to keep him immobilized without breaking the bone, yet. Julian let out a strangled yelp, his knees buckling. "Don't reach," the guard said, his voice a low, gravelly warning. Soraya stood slowly, brushing the dust and shards of ornaments from her dark uniform. The tear in her sleeve was a jagged reminder of the violence she had just endured, but her posture was no longer that of a victim. She stood in the center of that circle like a jewel in a vault. The guards didn't look at her, out of respect, or perhaps out of fear of what their king would do if they were caught staring, but they shifted their weight collectively to shield her from Julian's view. The silence in the mall was now absolute, save for the distant, rhythmic thud of approaching footsteps. The circle didn't break, but the guards at the far end stepped back to form a narrow aisle. They stood at attention, their chins tucked, their eyes fixed on the floor. Julian, still held by the wrist, looked toward the opening. The panic in his chest was now a physical weight, crushing his lungs. He had spent his life thinking he was the top of the food chain, but as the temperature in the room seemed to plummet, he realized he was nothing more than bait. The circle wasn't just there to keep Julian in. It was a ceremonial ring, prepared for the arrival of a king. And as the first shadow of a long black coat appeared at the edge of the aisle, Soraya felt the vibration of the marble floor change. The man who hated women had arrived, and he wasn't here for them all. He was here for the maid Julian had dared to touch. The perimeter of the circle was as impenetrable as a tomb. 12 men, each standing over 6 feet tall and clad in charcoal gray suits that absorbed the mall's brilliant light, moved with a haunting, synchronized grace. They didn't speak. They didn't shout. They simply occupied the space around Soraya and Julian, creating a human wall that separated the wreckage of the Christmas display from the rest of the world. Julian's breath hitched in his throat. He turned in a full circle, his eyes darting from one stone-faced guard to the next, looking for a crack in the formation, a glimmer of hesitation, or even a hint of a bribe he could offer. He found nothing but the cold, professional indifference of killers. These weren't mall security guards, they were the elite vanguards of the Han Syndicate, men handpicked for their loyalty and their lethality. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Julian's voice cracked, the pitch rising in a desperate attempt to reclaim the authority he had felt just moments ago. He reached into his coat, perhaps for a business card or his wallet, but the movement was too sudden. The rhythmic click of polished Oxfords against the marble was the only sound in the cavernous mall, a steady, predatory heartbeat that grew louder with every second. The circle of guards snapped into a rigid salute, their heads bowing in a wave of terrifying discipline. Then, he appeared. Han Saiwu stepped through the aisle, his long black cashmere coat billowing behind him like the wings of a dark angel. He didn't look at the luxury stores, the shattered crystal, or the whispering crowd. His eyes, cold as the winter sea, were locked solely on the woman standing in the center of the wreckage. Julian's breath hitched, a soft, pathetic sound in the absolute silence. He tried to scramble backward, but the guard's grip on his wrist was an iron vice. The air around Saiwu seemed to vibrate with a suppressed, lethal energy that made the skin crawl. He stopped 3 paces from Soraya. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, taking in the tear in her uniform, the dust on her skin, and the faint tremble in her hands. The king who hated women looked at his mother's maid with a gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. Slowly, Saiwu reached out. His gloved hand didn't go for a weapon. Instead, he gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind Soraya's ear. His touch was impossibly light, a stark contrast to the violence radiating from his silhouette. "I told you to wait for the car," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that carried to every corner of the silent atrium. Finally, he turned his head. The transition was instantaneous. The softness he had shown Soraya vanished, replaced by a gaze so sharp it felt like a blade against Julian's throat. Saiwu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You, he said, the single word carrying the weight of a death sentence. Julian began to shake violently, realization finally dawning on him. He hadn't just tripped a servant, he had desecrated the only sanctuary the devil of Seoul possessed. The king had descended, not to negotiate, but to collect a debt that Julian would spend the rest of his very short life paying. Saiwoo's hand dropped from Soraya's face, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. The air in the atrium seemed to thicken, the oxygen replaced by a suffocating sense of dread. With a slow, deliberate movement, Saiwoo turned his body toward Julian. The guard holding Julian's arm didn't need a verbal command, he shoved Julian forward, forcing him to his knees in the center of the shattered glass and gold dust. Julian's knees hit the marble with a sickening crack, right beside the spot where Soraya had been sprawled moments before. He tried to avert his eyes, his breath coming in jagged, pathetic hitches, but Saiwoo stepped into his field of vision. The king reached down, grabbing Julian by the chin with a grip so forceful that the man's teeth audibly ground together. He tilted Julian's head back, forcing him to stare upward. "Look at her," Saiwoo commanded. The words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of a falling guillotine. Julian's eyes darted frantically, overflowing with tears of terror. He tried to squeeze them shut, but Saiwoo's thumb pressed into the nerve behind his jaw, a silent promise of agony. "I said, look at her." Julian finally fixed his gaze on Soraya. She stood tall now, framed by the elite circle of suits, the light from the chandeliers catching the tear in her uniform. For the first time, Julian didn't see a maid. He didn't see the woman he had abandoned in the rain. He saw a shadow of the power that now stood behind her, a power that made his entire world feel like a house of cards in a hurricane. "The woman you kicked," Saiwoo whispered, his face inches from Julian's, "is the heart of the Han household. She is the hands that care for my mother and the only soul in this city I have sworn to protect." Saiwoo's eyes were black pits of retribution. "You looked at her and saw someone you could break. Now, you will look at her and see the last thing you will ever lose. Because from this moment on, Julian, you have no name, no company, and no future. You exist only as a monument to your own mistake." Saiwoo let go of Julian's face with a shove that sent the man's head snapping back. He didn't look back as Julian collapsed into the shards of crystal, sobbing. Saiwoo simply turned to Soraya, his silent invitation for her to walk beside him, not behind him, as the first stage of the reckoning began. Saiwoo stood over the trembling man, his silhouette casting a long, jagged shadow across the white marble. The air in the locked mall felt heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and expensive cologne. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a pair of obsidian black leather gloves, pulling them on slowly, finger by finger. The sound of the leather stretching was like a whip crack in the silence. "In my world, Julian, everything has a price," Saiwoo began, his voice dropping to a register that made the glass in the nearby display cases hum. "We call it the debt of blood. You see, when you struck Soraya, you didn't just bruise skin. You damaged the property of the Han family. You insulted the woman who guards my mother's peace. And in the underworld, an insult to the Queen's circle is paid for in pound of flesh." Julian tried to speak, but only a wet, pathetic wheezing sound escaped his throat. He looked toward Soraya, his eyes begging for a mercy she no longer owed him. Saiwoo stepped closer, his boot coming to rest inches from Julian's face. "You kicked her with your right leg," Saiwoo noted, his tone chillingly clinical. "You used your status to try and erase hers. So, I will take exactly what you used. I will take your standing. I will take your mobility. And by the time the sun rises, I will have taken the very ground you think you own." Saiwoo turned his head slightly toward the lead guard. "Every asset Julian Vane owns, his villas, his offshore accounts, his family's legacy, I want them liquidated by dawn. And as for his right leg, ensure he never uses it to stand over anyone ever again." The screams began then, but they were muffled as the guards moved in, a wall of charcoal suits closing the gap. Saiwoo didn't flinch. He walked back to Soraya, placing a firm, protective hand on the small of her back. The debt was being collected, and for the first time in his life, the king who hated women realized that some debts were worth far more than gold. He led her toward the exit, leaving the sounds of Julian's world collapsing behind them. The heavy steel gates of the mall didn't just open, they were commanded aside. A secondary motorcade of cream-colored Rolls-Royces glided into the loading bay, and the air in the latte wing shifted from the cold dread of a hunt to the suffocating weight of an imperial court. Madame Han stepped out, her silver hair styled with surgical precision, her silk hanbok whispering against the marble. She did not look like a woman in her 70s, she looked like an ancient deity arriving to survey a battlefield. Behind her, a personal detachment of female guards followed, their movements as fluid and lethal as those of Saiwoo's men. Madame Han's gaze didn't flicker toward the luxury boutiques or the trembling crowd of socialites. It went straight to the center of the circle, where Soraya stood. Julian, pinned to the floor by the enforcers, let out a choked sound of hope. He recognized the matriarch of the Han family from the society pages. He thought, in his desperate delusion, that a woman of her status would surely bring order to the chaos her son had unleashed. "Madam," he croaked, reaching out a bloodied hand. "Please, your son, he's insane. I only tripped a maid. This is a mistake." Madame Han stopped inches from him. She didn't look down. Instead, she looked at Soraya, her eyes softening into a look of profound, maternal tenderness. "Soraya, my child," she said, her voice carrying through the atrium like a silken thread. "Did he hurt you?" Soraya's voice was small but steady. "I'm okay, madam." Madame Han finally turned her eyes to Julian. The temperature in the mall seemed to drop another 10 degrees. She didn't scream. She didn't even sneer. She looked at him with the clinical boredom one might show a cockroach. "You call her a maid as if it were a slur," the matriarch whispered, stepping over Julian's hand as if it were a piece of litter. "She is the woman who held my hand when the doctors said I wouldn't walk. She is the soul of this family." She turned to Saiwoo, who stood like a stone sentinel. "Saiwoo, you were too slow. If this creature can still speak, you haven't been thorough enough." She reached out and took Soraya's hand, pulling her into an embrace that signaled to every camera and every witness in the city, Soraya Ellington was no longer just staff. She was a Han. And as the matriarch led her toward the waiting cars, Julian realized the maid wasn't just protected by the king, she was loved by the queen. Julian remained on the floor, his world a chaotic blur of polished marble and charcoal gray trousers. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling with the hope that his lawyers, his father, or his influence could still save him. But as the screen flickered to life, the notifications began to pour in like a relentless digital execution. The first alert was from his private bank. Account frozen. Under investigation. He blinked, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then came the next. Stock options, liquidated. And another. Property title transfer, pending. In the span of 60 seconds, the vast wealth that Julian had used as a weapon his entire life was being systematically dismantled by an invisible hand. "What are you doing?" he croaked, looking up at Saiwoo, who was calmly checking his watch. "You can't just, that's 3 generations of my family's work." "3 generations of work," Saiwoo replied, his voice a terrifyingly calm whisper, "erased because you couldn't keep your foot off a woman who is worth more than your entire bloodline. You think your money made you powerful, Julian. But in my city, money is just paper. Power is the ability to make you disappear while you're still standing in the middle of a crowded room." Julian's phone buzzed one last time. It was a text from his father, the man who had always cleaned up his messes. It read, "Don't come home. We've lost everything. They took the house, Julian. They took it all." The reality finally crashed down on him. The stores surrounding him, the designer brands he frequented, the people who used to bow to him, now felt like the walls of a cell. Every connection he had, every person who had ever returned his calls, had just been bought or buried by the Han Syndicate. Saiwoo leaned down, his shadow eclipsing Julian's broken form. You aren't a CEO anymore, Julian. You aren't even a citizen. You are a ghost. He turned his back on the man who was now a beggar in a $5,000 suit. Julian sat in the center of the mall, surrounded by thousands of carats of diamonds and gold, yet he had never been more destitute in his life. The erasure was complete. He was still breathing, but his world was dead. The chaos of the mall had settled into a heavy, expectant silence, broken only by the sound of Julian's ragged, sobbing breaths. He sat in the center of the wreckage, a man stripped of his name, his fortune, and his pride. Han Saiwoo stood by Soraya's side, his presence a towering wall of dark authority, waiting for a single word from her to determine the final fate of the man who had tried to break her. One word, Soraya, Saiwoo said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hum that only she could hear. Do you want him gone? Do you want him to spend the rest of his life in a cell, or should I simply let the streets take what's left of him? Soraya stepped forward, her dark uniform still torn, her elbow bandaged with a silken cloth provided by one of the guards. She looked down at Julian. For years, he had been the monster in her nightmares, the architect of her deepest despairs. But as she looked at him now, shivering, clutching a useless phone, and surrounded by the literal glass shards of his own ego, the fear that had gripped her heart for so long finally evaporated. Mercy is for the worthy, Julian, Soraya said, her voice clear and resonant, echoing off the gold leaf ceilings. But you aren't even worth my hate anymore. She turned to Saiwoo, her eyes shining with a newfound, ironclad peace. Don't kill him, Saiwoo. That would be too quick. Let him live. Let him walk out of this mall with absolutely nothing. Let him see every person he once looked down on pass him by without a second glance. Let him be exactly what he called me, a nobody. Saiwoo's lips thinned into a ghost of a smile, a rare, dangerous expression of approval. He signaled to his men. The enforcer who had been pinning Julian down stepped back, releasing him as if he were a piece of contaminated waste. You heard her, Saiwoo said, his eyes turning back to ice as they landed on Julian. Get out. If you are still within the city limits by sunset, the mercy ends. Julian scrambled to his feet, his right leg dragging slightly, and began to run toward the now opening gates. He didn't look back. Soraya watched him go, and as the heavy steel doors finally parted to let the cold winter air in, she felt the last of her past life blow away with the wind. She wasn't the maid who had been kicked, she was the woman who had survived the fire, and she was finally, truly free. The drive back to the Han estate was a journey through a world that had fundamentally shifted. The interior of the armored SUV was a cocoon of silent luxury, the only sound being the soft purr of the engine as it glided through the neon-lit streets of Seoul. Soraya sat in the plush leather seat, the matriarch's heavy silk shawl draped over her shoulders like a royal mantle. Beside her, Han Saiwoo remained a statue of dark, brooding intensity, his gaze fixed on the passing city lights. As the massive iron gates of the villa groaned open and the car swept up the winding, cherry blossom line drive, the familiar sight of the limestone mansion felt different. It was no longer just the place where she worked, it was the fortress that had mobilized to save her. Saiwoo was out of the car before the driver could reach the door. He didn't wait for his men, he stepped back to the door and reached out a hand to Soraya. His fingers were bare now, the leather gloves gone, and for the first time, his touch wasn't just protective, it was hesitant. As she stepped onto the gravel, her legs felt heavy with the weight of the day's adrenaline. Before she could take a full step, Saiwoo's arm was around her waist, anchoring her. I can walk, Saiwoo, she whispered, though she didn't pull away. I know you can, he replied, his voice a low, gravelly vibration in the cool night air. But today, you shouldn't have to. Inside the grand foyer, the staff stood in a silent, respectful line, their heads bowed deeper than usual. The news of what had happened at the mall, and how the king had reacted, had reached the villa long before the cars did. Saiwoo ignored them all, leading Soraya toward the private wing, past the gold leaf mirrors and the portraits of ancestors who had built this empire on blood and loyalty. He stopped at the door to her quarters, but he didn't leave. He turned to face her, the shadow of the hallway playing across the sharp angles of his face. The woman-hater was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he was seeing a ghost. "My mother is already in her rooms," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, honest register. "But I needed to know. Why didn't you call me sooner? Why did you let him touch you?" Soraya looked up at him, seeing the flicker of pain behind his cold eyes. "I've spent my life being told I wasn't worth the help, Saiwoo." He stepped closer, his hand coming up to rest on the doorframe beside her head, effectively pinning her with his presence. "You are the only thing in this house that isn't a weapon or a trophy, Soraya. To me, that makes you the most dangerous thing of all." In the silence of the villa, the distance between them closed, the air thick with the realization that the maid and the king were no longer playing their parts. The ice had finally shattered. The transformation was finalized not with a crown, but with a document. A month after the glass had shattered in the latte luxury wing, Soraya stood in the center of the villa's grand library, the morning sun illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. On the desk before her lay a leather-bound folder. Inside was the deed to the very mall where Julian had tried to erase her existence. It was no longer a monument to her humiliation, it was now her property, the headquarters for the foundation she was building to protect women who, like her, had once been told they were disposable. Han Saiwoo stood by the window, his silhouette as sharp and formidable as ever, but the coldness that usually defined him had shifted into something else, a quiet, unwavering pride. He watched her sign the final page, her hand steady, her eyes clear. The woman-hating king had been conquered, not by a rival, but by the quiet resilience of the woman who had cared for his mother when no one else would. Madame Han entered the room, her presence as regal as the day she had reclaimed Soraya on the mall floor. She placed a hand on Soraya's shoulder, her eyes shimmering with a rare, soft light. "You were never just a maid, Soraya," she whispered. "You were the missing piece of this family. Today, the world finally knows it." Saiwoo walked toward them, stopping only when he was inches from Soraya. He didn't look at the deed or the wealth it represented. He looked at her. "The city used to fear the Han name because of the blood we spilled," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "Now, they will respect it because of the woman who leads it." He reached out, his hand finding hers and interlacing their fingers. Soraya looked at their joined hands, the Mafia king and the woman who had risen from the ashes of his mother's service. She was no longer a shadow in the hallway, she was the light in the fortress. As they stepped out onto the balcony to look over the city of Seoul, the message was clear to all who watched from below. The reign of the new queen had begun, and under her protection, no one would ever have to stand alone in the dark again.